Hi everyone, Pastor Stephen here. Welcome back to our Bible study on Leviticus. We're going to be looking at part 2 today. We're going to look at chapters 8 through 11. Now, it's important to remind ourselves before we begin what the theme of Leviticus is. Because remember, if we don't understand what the theme of the book is, we're not going to understand we're not going to get the point. If you're really going to understand the importance of Leviticus and the message of Leviticus, then we have to remember what is the theme. The theme is, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground. For I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. And that phrase, that's everything. The be holy, for I am holy. That is the point. That is the theme of Leviticus. God is teaching Israel, and in turn, us. What does it mean to be holy? And why should we be holy? We should be holy because God is holy. Now, we have to remember, excuse me, we have to remember, just like we did from last time, what is holiness about? What does holiness mean? Of course, holiness means not just being good, like we said last time. If we think that holiness is just about behaving yourself, then we're missing the point of being holy. So if we're to be holy, what does that mean? And of course, the idea of being holy is to be set apart. God is holy because there's nothing like him. He's set apart from all things. We are holy because we also are set apart. Israel, he called Israel to be holy. Why? Because he set them apart. He called them to be a people. He called them to be his people. And within that people, he calls a priesthood. Now, the priesthood is crucial, especially when we remember that in the ancient Near East, which was the Old Testament Israel time and before, the concept of being holy was seen especially in the idea of sacred space. Now, if you remember, sacred space is the part of the earth where the spiritual connects with the physical, where the gods would connect with the realm of man. And all cultures believed in sacred spaces, and Israel was no different. And for Israel, after they're released from Egypt, after they're freed from Egypt and they go into the wilderness, God establishes his sacred space in the form of the tabernacle. So in the tabernacle, let's get this going here. The tabernacle was placed in the center of the camp. And of course, this is where the sacred space was. This is where the presence of God dwelled. This is where God stayed among the people. Of course, cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. So in the instructions that we found, as we talked about last time in the last video, the instructions we find in Leviticus 1 through 7 is all about the offerings and the sacrifices used to be able to be in the presence of God. There were the two different types of sacrifices, if you remember. There was the sacrifice of presence, and then there was the sacrifice of purification. So you would make 3 sacrifices about being in the presence. That was the burnt offering, that was the grain offering, and then that was the peace offering. The burnt offering was to get permission to be in God's presence. The grain offering was about remembering your covenant with God, and the peace offering was about you celebrating the fact that you had peace with God. And then you also had 2 other things. If you did something wrong, you would have the guilt offering and the sin offering. You would have, in other words, the purification offering. If you accidentally did something wrong, in order to not contaminate the sacred space, you would offer this purification offering to be pure again. And then if you did something and you know it was bad, but for some reason you chose to do it anyway. Not that you were being defiant, but for some reason you had to do it. You felt you needed to do it. That was what the reciprocation offering was all about. You would pay back the wrong that you did in order to still be in the presence of God. Now, the idea of sacred space is this, and this is why we said the priesthood was so important. In order to keep the sacred space sacred and pure, to not let it be profaned or contaminated, fewer and fewer people would be able to, as you moved closer to the center of the tabernacle, fewer and fewer people were allowed to go in there. So you would have everyone out and around the outside of the tent, and to a certain point they could go inside the gate of the tabernacle. You see kind of my cursor there on the screen. They're really kind of allowed up to the burnt offering altar. But then once you get past this point, and even as you go into the tent, only the priesthood was allowed to go, because God wants to keep the sacred space holy. So the closer to the center of the tabernacle you would go, the fewer number of people could go there. Michael Heiser talks about this when he says, when you welcome the presence of God into the tabernacle, you have to be extremely careful that everything and everybody has been purged from impurity, so that the presence of God is not polluted. Now, this is what we see in Leviticus 8 and 9. In Leviticus 8 and 9, you have the calling and the sanctification of Aaron and his sons as the priesthood. They are going to be the ones that serves in the tabernacle. They are going to be the ones that maintain the presence of God. And they're set apart even by the people, by the clothing. God, in Leviticus 8 and Leviticus 9, and even in more detail in Exodus, they're commanded to wear certain articles of clothing as they serve. The regular priests, for lack of a better term, the regular priests would be dressed all in white. And then the high priest, Aaron, which would be originally Aaron, he has his own uniform, including along the bottom, and this is what's interesting, along the bottom he would have bells along the bottom of his robe. Now the reason for that is when he goes into the one place only he was allowed to go. When he would go into the holiest of holies, they couldn't follow him in. He had to go by himself, as we're going to learn in chapter 16. As long as the bells were ringing, that meant Aaron was moving. That meant he was still alive. If something happens to the high priest and they die while they're in the holiest of holies, how do you know? How do you get them out? You listen for the bells. And if the bells stop ringing, they knew to use the rope that was attached to him and drag him out, because he did something wrong or he died in the presence of God, and you could not go in, because again, that would profane the sacred space. Now they learned this very hard lesson in Leviticus chapter 10. Leviticus chapter 10 gives us this very dark story about the priests failing. See, God gives the priests instructions about what to do, and then they fail. It doesn't take them very long to fail. We read in the first 3 verses of Leviticus 10, now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, 2 of the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, and laid incense in it, and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed him, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord has said, among those who are near me I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. God teaches the priesthood a hard lesson. And the hard lesson is this: you can't come before me any way you want. When it comes to maintaining the presence of God, we must approach God on his terms, not on ours. We don't know exactly what the sons of Aaron did to mess up, what exactly is meant by the strange fire that they offered. Most likely they went into the Holy of Holies, which only because we see, as we're going to see in chapter 16, we have instructions that Aaron alone, as the high priest, is supposed to go into the Holy of Holies. So most likely that's what they did, but we don't have any details exactly what was meant by their unauthorized fire, or the, as the popular phrase is, the strange fire that they offered up. But the idea is separating what is sacred and what is common. Now, the problem is when we do something to profane the sacred space, it becomes common again. What Aaron's sons did was they did something that God did not authorize. They did something that God did not ask them to do or tell them to do. So that profanes the sacred space. So God has to teach them this lesson. Don't profane what is sacred, because then it becomes common. And once something becomes common, it must be sanctified again. It must be purified in order to become sacred again. We have to maintain the sacred space. In other words, if you're going to treat something as holy, you have to treat it a certain way. You have to treat it as precious. You have to treat it as something that is more precious than anything. You can't just treat it as any other thing that, that you want to treat it as. So the narrative in chapter 10 sets up the next section of Leviticus. Really, Leviticus 10, really Leviticus 8, 9, and 10 serve as a transition from part 1. Leviticus part 1 would be chapters 1 through 7. Now we're moving into part 2, which would be Leviticus 11 through 17 or 18. So these 3 chapters serve as that transition, because what we have in Leviticus 10 is the whole purpose of the next few chapters of Leviticus. We read later on in chapter 10, you are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean, and you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. So how do we distinguish between the holy and the common? We do that by looking at what makes a person clean, what makes a person unclean. And so God starts instructing them through Moses. What is clean? What is unclean? We begin in chapter 11, somewhat bizarrely. We begin in chapter 11 by talking about the types of animals that can make a person clean or unclean. You begin in chapter 11 by talking about what you can eat and what can't you eat. What makes you clean, what makes you unclean. So here's the structure of Leviticus chapter 11. It begins, the first 23 verses, it begins by listing the animals that are clean and unclean. As you can see, verses 1 through 8 talks about land creatures. 9 through 12 talks about water creatures, and then 13 through 23 talks about creatures of the air. And that includes birds and also insects. He separates what's clean and what's unclean. And then the second part of the chapter gives instructions regarding those. If you get polluted by something that's unclean, here's what you do to become clean again. And then verses 41 through 45, he draws some conclusions about the teaching. And then verse 46 and 47, and that's where he gives a brief summary of what is being talked about in the chapter. Now, this is a basic breakdown of our clean and unclean listings. Now, the Bible Leviticus 11 goes into much greater detail, and really we could spend a couple of hours kind of hashing over all the details, but this is kind of the Cliff Notes version. This is essentially what God breaks it down to. With the land creatures, the simple breakdown is this. If the animal has a cloven hoof and it chews the cud, it's clean to eat. Go for it. It's fine to eat. You can be clean by coming into contact with those animals. All other type of land creatures, though, will make you unclean. You can't eat all other cud. Has to be cloven hooved, and it has to be chewing the cud. Otherwise, it will be unclean. Now, with the water creatures, in other words, the creatures of the sea, what makes one of those animals clean? They have to have both fins and scales. If they're lacking one of those or both of those, then they're unclean. All other sea creatures, if they don't have fins, if they don't have scales, then they are considered to be unclean, and the Israelite is not to touch them. Now, when it comes to the creatures of the air, essentially all God does is list what makes you unclean. And what makes a person unclean is coming into contact or eating birds of prey, or those that feast on carcasses of other animals. So, essentially, meat-eating birds. And then flying insects. Now, the interesting thing is, hopping insects are fine to eat. Hopping insects are considered to be clean. The flying insects are considered to be unclean. Now, this is important because when we fast forward to the New Testament and we look at John the Baptist, what's his diet? His diet is locusts and wild honey. And well, locust is considered to be a hopping bug, grasshoppers, things like that. They can eat those. Thankfully, that is not part of our culture here in America, but for over there, when you basically tried to eat what you could, God says, yes, those are clean. But if it's a flying bug, those are unclean. Now, we called this a somewhat confusing set of rules, and the reason we say it is this. We say these are a confusing set of rules because scholars don't really have a consensus as to what the rhyme or reason is with these rules. Scholars don't really have a consensus as to the purpose of these rules. Leviticus doesn't tell us why God gives them these rules. He doesn't give any great detail as to why the Israelites are called to follow these list of rules and what makes these animals clean versus these other animals that are unclean. There's a number of theories among scholarship today. And there are four main theories are basically this. The first one is, well, it's an arbitrary thing. God only knows the reason why he gives this command, and it may be just simply a fact that he's testing them in obedience. Maybe there's no real reason other than just simply to test the Israelites to see if they will obey these commands. Okay. The second one is cultic. Now, you need to understand something. When we say cultic, it's not cults like we understand today. Cultic is a term used in scholarship that just basically means sacred worship. So when you read a book that talks about the cult of Yahweh, they're not calling the Jewish people, they're not calling Christianity a cult. Instead, it's just simply a general academic term describing sacred acts and worship practices and things like that. So the general theory is that maybe the callings are cultic. In other words, certain animals Israelites are to stay away from because they have to do with pagan worship. They're connected with pagan worship. That's a possibility. The problem with that theory is bulls and calves and rams were also connected to pagan worship. The Egyptians used bulls all the time with their worship. So how can we say that it's you stay away from these animals simply because they're connected with pagan religions, and yet God says, but go ahead and use these animals that are also connected to pagan religions? So we don't really buy into the whole cultic aspect of it. Some purport hygienic reasons behind it. God knows that these certain animals are disease-ridden and they carry diseases, and so for the Israelites to stay healthy and to protect them from these diseases, he says, don't eat these. It makes sense when you talk about the carrion animals, when you talk about the animals that eat other animals or eat other carcasses, and to stay away from carcasses because that makes you unclean. So that's a possibility. The fourth one is symbolic. In other words, God wants to establish the idea of things being set apart. Israel is represented by the clean animals. These animals have been set apart from the other animals unto God, and they've been called holy unto God. So the clean animals are symbolic of Israel, and all these unclean animals are symbolic of the pagan cultures around them, of the non-Israelites, of what comes to be known as the Gentiles. Now this makes sense in light of what happens in the New Testament. There seems to be a radical shift in the New Testament when Jesus comes into the scene, because we have this passage in Matthew in chapter 15. Starting in verse 10, it reads, "And he called the people to him, and said to them, Hear and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person." Then the disciples came to him and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" One of the reasons that they're offended by this is because dietary laws have come to be a real mark of a true, faithful Jewish person. Your piety was very well known and measured by your following of these dietary laws. And Jesus answered, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They're blind guides." I love it. Jesus said, don't worry about what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about. "If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." But Peter said to him, could you explain that parable? I love when they do this. Peter's like, wait, what? What does that mean? Can you explain the parable to us? And he said, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." Now this passage is essentially in connection with the Pharisees going to Jesus and complaining that his disciples aren't washing their hands, which you were supposed to do before you ate. You're supposed to wash your hands because it was a purification thing. And Jesus is like, look, that's not what makes you unclean, and what you eat doesn't make you unclean. It's not what goes into the mouth, it's what comes out of the mouth that makes a person unclean. Now Mark, in covering this passage, gives us a very interesting note. He includes this note in chapter 7, verse 19. "Thus he declared all foods clean." So does Jesus say all of those dietary laws, everything that you guys read about in Leviticus chapter 11, we can now throw those out the window? How does that coincide with the idea of Jesus saying, "I've not come to abolish the law, because not the smallest detail of the law will be abolished"? So what does this mean? Well, we get better understanding when we look at Acts chapter 10, when we get the story about Peter's vision and being called to the house of Cornelius. In chapter 10, starting in verse 9, "The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray, and he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, 'Rise, Peter, kill and eat.' But Peter said, 'By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean.' And the voice came to him again a second time, 'What God has made clean, do not call common.' This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven." So does God call Peter to violate Leviticus chapter 11? No, I think what's going on here is what Jesus says in Matthew 10, and what God says here again in Acts chapter 10. is he's explaining what the whole purpose of those dietary laws were all about. You are set apart. But now God is changing. He's not so much changing, God's revealing the evolution of the plan. Because now Israel isn't going to be as set apart, because God is now welcoming in the Gentiles. So God says, look, my people are the whole world now. I'm taking back all these other nations. All these other nations that I've given over to these other gods, according to Deuteronomy chapter 32, I'm coming to take them back. And I'm using you guys to take them back. I called you as a people. Remember, Peter was a Jew. I called you as a people. I set you apart. You were my people. And I did so in order to use you to bring the world back to me. So I think there's a lot to say about these dietary laws being symbolic, as in, you are set apart, just like I've set these animals apart. Mary Douglas, in her book Purification and Danger, writes this: these laws were like signs which at every turn inspired meditation on the oneness, purity, and completeness of God. By rules of avoidance, holiness was given a physical expression in every encounter with the animal kingdom and at every meal. Observance of the dietary rules would then have been a meaningful part of the great liturgical act of recognition and worship, which culminated in the sacrifice of the temple. So every aspect of the Israelites' life was to be a reminder, a remembrance that they were set apart. And the dietary laws were no different. Just because something is seemed okay by the rest of the world doesn't mean it's okay for a person that follows God. They are set apart. So certain things, their diets have to be set apart as well. But when God said it's time to bring everyone in, he removes that aspect of the dietary laws. He removes that symbolism. He says, don't consider things to be unclean, what I have considered clean. And for Peter, that meant go and start preaching to the Gentiles, because I want to bring the Gentiles in on this salvation thing. Salvation is for the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. Jesus is saying, look, it's not the letter of the law that makes you clean or unclean. It's the spirit of the law. It doesn't matter if you're eating the right things if your heart's in the wrong place. And so Peter gets this call, go out into all the world, because the symbolic aspects of those laws do not apply anymore. We're doing a new thing. Salvation is for all. So with that being the case, what do we as modern Christians take away from these laws? What do we take away from Leviticus chapter 11? Much like what Mary Douglas says in here, as these are reminders of that they are set apart and holy, we are to do the same thing. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. May we be reminded that we are also set apart. We are to answer the call to be holy, because God is holy. And because we're set apart, just like with the Israelites, we need to separate ourselves from certain things. Not necessarily because they're bad in of themselves, but because we dwell with the presence of God. And if we want to dwell in the presence of God and we want to be closer to God, then that's going to mean setting ourselves apart from certain things. We leave certain things out of our lives in order to be able to approach the presence of God. So what do we take from these strange dietary laws? We remind ourselves, just as the Israelites were to remind themselves, that we are a holy people, that we are to be set apart. He called us out of darkness. We don't just do anything we want because we want to be in the presence of God. We approach God on his terms. And because we approach God on his terms, he's going to call us to set aside certain things. So just like the spirit of Leviticus 11 Set aside what God calls you to set aside. Lay it down for the sake of drawing closer to Him.